Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel. Today, I'm going to go through every Kiss studio album and pick my favorite and least favorite song from each record. They have a pretty expansive catalog, so let's get started. Kicking things off with their 1974 self-titled debut album here. The best song on this record, in my opinion, has got to be Black Diamond. The vocal intro by Paul is incredible before, the riff kicks in and you get Peter's vocals there as well. And this is one of my favorite Peter Criss vocal performances of all time. His raspy voice, I think, was perfect for this track. And this is a perfect example of just how tight the original four were, at the beginning, when they all worked together before all the bad blood, right? I mean, these original four guys had so much chemistry, and it's all on display. Everyone gets to shine on this track. Just an amazing closer to their debut album. Least favorite here on this record, gotta be Kissin' Time. It's an unnecessary cover that was added to the subsequent pressings after the initial press of their debut, and I never cared for this cover. Just kind of sits there, and, compared to classics on this record like Strutter and Nothing to Lose, Firehouse, Cold Gin, Deuce, I just don't think it adds much to the album. Moving on now to Hotter Than Hell, their sophomore record here. Favorite song has got to be Parasite. In my opinion, the first ever thrash metal song, and that riff is just so thrashy. Classic Ace Frehley riffing going on here, and the band sound very tight. Ace wouldn't sing it at the time, but I love Gene's delivery here of Ace's lyrics. Fantastic song. Love the cover by Anthrax as well. Like I said, this definitely is, some of the roots and origins of thrash metal here, and Ace Frehley with one of his best Kiss performances on guitar, so some tremendous stuff here. My favorite song on this awesome album. If I had to pick a worst on Hotter Than Hell, I guess it would have to be All the Way. Not a bad song at all. I really have nothing bad to say about this track, and Hotter Than Hell is a great album from top to bottom, except for the production, but I guess All the Way is, a pretty forgotten song buried on the record. If I had to pick a least favorite, it would probably be this one, but just like when I did the Iron Maiden video here of the best and worst from each album, I'm definitely going to have to nitpick for some of these early classic Kiss albums, and so with All the Way, a very fine song, nothing bad about it, but just my least favorite. Next, we have Dressed to Kill from 1975. Favorite song on here is also my favorite Kiss song of all time as well, that being She. The riff is one of my favorites that Ace ever wrote, and it just has this heavy, plotting vibe to it with great vocal harmonies there as well, and just awesome stuff. The production is pretty flat on Dressed to Kill, but this is a tremendous live track too. Probably the best version of She is from the Midnight Special in 1975. Definitely a song I think should have been played live a lot more often, so phenomenal song, my all-time favorite Kiss track, and my favorite on Dressed to Kill, gotta be She. Dressed to Kill is probably the least strong of their first three records, but still a lot of great tracks on here, so picking a worst was hard, but I'm going to have to go with Getaway. Written by Ace Frehley with vocals by Peter Criss. It's simplistic and catchy, but more of a filler track on Dressed to Kill more than anything else, and again, like I said, I'm definitely nitpicking here because, most of the songs from the original band range from good to great. After that, we have the monstrous Destroyer record from 1976. My favorite song on here, at the best, has got to be God of Thunder for me. Just the quintessential Gene Simmons track. Oddly enough, written by Paul Stanley. And the original demo of the track has Paul on lead vocals. It feels like an entirely different song, and I think regardless of who sang it, the best decision they could have done for God of Thunder was to slow it down compared to the demo version. I think it was a great call by producer Bob Ezrin to give this one to Gene. It just fits his vocal delivery to a T and the demon character as well. So, perfect match here for Gene Simmons. Great song, and really the personification of the demon character. Epic track on Destroyer. This was a hard one to pick a worst for, but I guess I'd have to go with Great Expectations. Not a bad song at all. I guess I could technically go with Rock and Roll Party, but I barely consider that a track. More of an outro to Do You Love Me, but Great Expectations just isn't on the level of some of the other heavy hitters on Destroyer, and I like the use of the chorus here. It's musically sound, but otherwise one of the weakest on the album. Moving on to the Rock and Roll Over record here, let's go with another classic Gene Simmons song with Calling Dr. Love. Another very classic, catchy Gene Simmons track here. Lots of fun, vintage Gene lyrics as well. Really good on the album, but even better live. The worst on this tremendous album, and largely underrated record as well, the worst has got to be See You in Your Dreams. Way better than the re-recorded version from Gene's 1978 solo album, but still the weakest track on Rock and Roll Over. And again, another phenomenal album, but if I had to choose, this is my least favorite on the record, or at the very least, the one with, I think, the least re-listenable qualities to it as far as I'm concerned. On to Love Gun from 1977. For the best song, I'm going to go with the title track. Legitimately one of the band's greatest hits. That's an all-time classic at the same time, and I never get tired of this song. You know, it's such a powerful and vibrant track. The chorus is a complete earworm, and Ace and Peter's backing vocals are absolutely killer, and as I've noticed, you know, very distinct compared to, you know, other Kiss lineup performances of this song live with the backing vocals. There's just something to Ace and Peter on this track that really makes it for me, and speaking of Ace, classic Ace guitar solo here as well. Killer title track, one of Kiss's all-time best. Well, this was easy, picking the worst on Love Gun, which otherwise would have been like a perfect 10 out of 10 record. It's my favorite Kiss album of all time, but what keeps it from being a 10 out of 10 is the final song on the record, Then She Kissed Me. You know, it's a pointless cover here the band really can't seem to make work, and if the album had ended on Plaster Caster, things would have been much better. Just an awful cover that I could never get into. Kiss released 5 previously unreleased brand new studio tracks for Alive 2 on side 4, and to be honest, I don't care much for the other 4, but Rocket Ride is a bona fide classic and some of Ace's finest work in the band. Classic Space Ace lyrics here, and, you know, a really infectious riff as well. This wouldn't sound out of place on any of the classic studio albums or any of Ace's solo albums either. My least favorite of the 5 studio tracks on Alive 2 is going to have to be Larger Than Life. The worst of the other 4, you know, this track is just filler. It feels like filler, it sounds like filler, nothing remarkable about it. I just feel like it's, you know, just kind of there to fill space on side 4 of Alive 2, and so, you know, for me, one of those tracks I always skip. I've listened to it in the past and just never grew on me. Following that up here with Dynasty from 1979. Favorite song on here has got to be Dirty Livin' by Peter Criss. On this channel, we love the cat. This is the only song that Peter bothered to play on Dynasty, and he steals the record in my opinion. You know, Dirty Livin' is just classic Peter Criss in every possible sense. It's groovy, and it really feels like an extension of his 1978 solo album, which Behind Aces is my second favorite of the solo albums, which I know might be an unpopular opinion, but it's very distinct compared to the other songs on this record here. I think it really stands out. Peter's one and only song, and it really pops. Dynasty is definitely an Ace Frehley dominated record, but Save Your Love is still the weakest song on the album for me. You know, I think the lyrics are cheesy, and I'm not a big fan of the backing vocals on here either. It's still fine, but Ace wrote much better lyrics on this album. Now to the criminally underrated and overlooked Unmasked album from 1980 here. Best song on here has got to be Naked City. Love the bass intro. You know, Unmasked is a super underrated album in the sense that, you know, it doesn't get talked about at all. You're just kind of buried in Kiss's catalog. It's an album full of deep cuts. You know, the lyrics are incredibly cheesy throughout, I'll give you that, but nevertheless, I love how pronounced Gene's bass is on this track, and you get glimpses of classic Gene Simmons for sure on an album where the band were really struggling to find themselves, and so that's why Naked City to me really stands out amongst the rest. Great song here, and again, some more of that bass work by Gene Simmons. It really is a highlight of this entire album. But like I said, you know, the biggest issue on Unmasked is the weak songwriting, and I think Easy As It Seems is a good example of this. Just lazy songwriting, the band sounded lost, and on an album full of solid deep cuts, this is a pretty forgettable song. Oh, God. Next up, we have the brutal Elder, music from the Elder here from 1981. I hate this album. Kiss going for a more conceptual thing and just sounded way dated and out of place, right? Kiss were trying to do something that was way out of their comfort zone here, and I commend them for trying, but it just doesn't work at all. And so that being said, this is my least favorite Kiss record, although, you know, it kind of competes with Hot in the Shade. Those are two pretty rough albums, but it was pretty easy choosing a favorite for this record, that being Dark Light. Really the only good song on here, in my opinion. Very underrated Ace Frehley track, and, you know, Ace didn't play much on The Elder, the final album with him in the band until Circus, where he also didn't play much on that album, but he ends his first Kiss tenure here really strong, and this track definitely feels different to the rest of the album, where otherwise the band take, you know, a weird experimental approach that sounds very dated by 1981, and so Dark Light, a definite standout on The Elder for me. And the worst, you know, I mean, it's like choosing just one awful song after another, so choosing the worst was difficult because I'm trying to decide which song I hate the most on this record, but it would have to be Fanfare, Just a Boy. I mean, imagine opening an album with this, you know, I cringe just when I hear this song. It's just abysmal, the lyrics and the vocals are atrocious, and again, I get what Kiss was going for with The Elder, but it just sounds so dated and poorly done, and the band were lost, their audience was shrinking, and this did them no favors. In fact, it probably scared people away, especially as the first song on the record. You know, Just a Boy is the worst track here, which is saying a lot, you know, and I think Paul's standalone falsetto is just like nails on a chalkboard here. After the Elder debacle, Kiss tried to make a classic-sounding album to follow it up, but the problem was their audience was gone, and so Creatures of the Night was definitely a very underrated album at the time. I think it's definitely gotten its flowers now, but at the time of its release, not too many people bought it. It didn't have a big audience in North America, but best song on here, far and away, is War Machine. Very heavy Gene Simmons track, oddly enough, co-written by Bryan Adams, and that riff is so powerful, and the chorus just hits you like a ton of bricks. Very strong album closer, and, in general, Creatures of the Night, if this album was released in the 70s, it would have been far more successful for them, and, I kind of wish it was, right, because there's so much great material on here, but War Machine definitely does steal it for me. The worst on Creatures of the Night has got to be Danger, a repetitive little song here by Paul Stanley. It's not bad, it's catchy, but just the definition of a throwaway track. Still, though, it's fun for what it is. Solid deep cut on an album full of awesome tracks. The band ditched the makeup for the first time for 1983's Lick It Up, the beginning of a new era for the band here. Best song on the album for me is Not for the Innocent by Gene Simmons, just a bone-crunchingly heavy Gene song. Kind of in the same vein as War Machine, great riff, really heavy vocals, his delivery here sounds super powerful. And picking my favorite on Lick It Up was tough, because this whole album is great, but Not for the Innocent is an amazing second track to follow up the fast-paced Exciter, and it slows things down a bit here, but with much more of a crunch. The worst on Lick It Up, gonna go with Dance All Over Your Face. And the weird thing about Gene on these Unmasked 80s albums is that he writes some really good stuff and some really underrated stuff. And then other times his lyrics just seem to fall off a cliff, and Dance All Over Your Face has this great groove to it, but the lyrics suck, unfortunately. And, it won't be the last time I say this about a Gene song as we navigate through these 80s records. 1984's Animalize. Great record here, the first and only with Mark St. John on guitar, replacing Vinnie Vincent. Best song on here for me is Under the Gun. Really great, fast-paced rocker of a track. Maybe a bit thrashy in places as well. Kiss definitely taking influence from some of the rising metal bands around this time, but a great Paul Stanley vocal performance too, and Paul is really the all-star of this record in my opinion, and maybe it has something to do with the fact that he produced the record, but he just sounds, his vocals sound really strong and energetic throughout, and so that's definitely a highlight, not just of this song, but the entire album. The worst for me is While the City Sleeps. Again, Gene's bad mid-80s lyrics on display, and Gene was pretty checked out by this point. Paul definitely has the best songs on Animalize, without a doubt, but, While the City Sleeps is a really forgettable song in my opinion, and, kind of like Gene didn't care about this track. It's a real throwaway song, and that's odd, because, I'm a fan of some of his other work on this album, like Murder in High Heels, very underrated, and Lonely is the Hunter as well, but this one just doesn't do anything for me. Time for the Asylum record from 1985. Best song here for me is King of the Mountain. Love the drum intro here by Eric Carr. He does some of his absolute best work on this album, and, King of the Mountain makes for a very explosive album opener, and as for this entire record, Asylum is hit or miss, but this is definitely Kiss, jumping on the hair metal bandwagon, doubling down after Animalize, and maybe the album peaks right away, but still some great playing here by new guitarist Bruce Kulick, great shredder, and Eric Carr, really makes this song for me as well, so great drumming, great guitar work here, very fine album opener, high energy, high octane, I dig it. And the worst, well, what do you know? It's another Gene Simmons track here. We have Love's a Deadly Weapon. For a song written by 4 people, including Stanley and Simmons, no one could save this track from mediocrity. Gene on lead vocals here with another unremarkable song from a time when he seemed like he could not have cared less as long as, the album sold and he could focus on Hollywood at the same time. As the 80s progressed, Kiss got progressively more glam metal, and that's really seen here on Crazy Nights. Favorite song here is Hell or High Water, one of my favorite Kiss deep cuts of all time, especially one of my favorites from this particular era of the band. A very catchy chorus, and again, more of Gene being hit or miss with his writing. This is the best of the 4 Gene tracks on the album, and I think it's pretty heavy. Definitely had the potential to be, a successful single as well, had they released it as one, but just goes to show that, Gene's 80s back catalog is really great when he actually tries. And we're back to Not Trying with No, 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 my least favorite song here. Love the intro, but hate the rest of the song. Described by Paul Stanley as the worst song they ever recorded, and for once, I actually agree with Paul Stanley. It's one of the worst for sure. Next, we have 1989's Hot in the Shade here. This is, like I said, it trades places with The Elder for my least favorite Kiss album from time to time, and so choosing a favorite was tough, but thankfully there is one really good song on here, and that's Little Caesar. Very overlooked track from, like I said, my least favorite record. I'm not a fan of Gene or Paul's work on this album, and it sounds like Kiss trying to be anybody and everybody except themselves, but Little Caesar really is the only saving grace on this album, with lead vocals by drummer Eric Carr. I think it makes for a great change in sound, especially on an overbloated album like Hot in the Shade, and Eric more than holds his own on lead vocals here, and they definitely should have let him, do new stuff on lead vocals more often, but was not something they did often. But here on Little Caesar, he sounds fantastic. Love his re-recorded version of Beth from Smashes, Thrashes, and Hits as well. Love the Rockology stuff they've put out, posthumously, so he's done a lot of, really strong vocal work, but unfortunately it's not something that's been highlighted all that much in the Kiss catalog, but he really shines here on Little Caesar. It's funny that Paul Stanley calls No, No, No the worst song in the Kiss discography when Read My Body exists. One of Paul's most embarrassing moments as a songwriter. The lyrics are terrible, and what's worse is the rapping section of this track. Just so cringeworthy. There was no low that Kiss wouldn't stoop to at this point to try and sound like whatever was popular, This is a direct ripoff of Def Leppard or Poison, and let's just say Paul Stanley doesn't do a very good Bret Michaels impression. Into the 90s here with Revenge, Kiss's return to writing more serious music. Favorite song on here has got to be Unholy. Gene Simmons co-wrote this track with Vinnie Vincent, who was brought back into the fold as a songwriter for Revenge. That turned into a lawsuit, but no doubt Unholy was Kiss's best track in years, and it kicks off the album with a newfound heaviness and aggression, as well as, a newfound motivation from Gene that had been lost on the last few records. One of my favorite Gene Simmons tracks of all time, and a great way to start the record. And as good as Unholy is, I just don't think the rest of Revenge is as strong. It's a definite step up for the band compared to what they were doing, but I've always been in the, Revenge is kind of overrated camp, and I never really got the appeal of the entire album. There are some great moments, but then there's also some really low lows here as well, and Spit is definitely one of them. Comically bad lyrics here that Gene should have left in the 80s, and maybe it would have sounded better with Paul on lead vocals, I'm not sure. Yes, Kiss's grunge album from 1997, Carnival of Souls. Best song on here is definitely Hate. Really killer Gene Simmons track to start the album. Gene's voice fits really well in this heavy, dark, and grungy environment, and Gene really steals the show on this record with some of his heaviest material in years. The lyrics are some of the more menacing that Gene had written in over a decade, and definitely the closest to the demon-like persona that Gene had without the makeup. So I think that's really interesting to examine from a lyrical standpoint, but Hate, very heavy stuff, and from that track, you think the rest of this album was going to be great. Admittedly, this is a bit of a guilty pleasure Kiss album for me. I know it's not very good, but still I enjoy tracks on here, but Hate, hands down, one of my favorite songs on the record, and in my opinion, the best. But not all of this album is great, and I think side 2 really lags, and the worst song on here for me is going to be I Walk Alone, with Bruce Kulick on lead vocals, and Bruce really brought a lot of insight into the more grungy sound on Carnival of Souls. This was definitely his project, and he does a great job on this record in general, but when he sings lead vocals on I Walk Alone, I have to turn the track off, because Bruce is just not a great singer, And I think this song, while providing some variety compared to just Gene or Paul on lead vocals, definitely suffers from, poor vocal delivery by Bruce Kulick. Not a great singer, like I said. I think that this song definitely suffers from that, and so I Walk Alone, my least favorite on the record. Really, a song that could have been fine, but it could have been fine if unremarkable, if I'm being honest. But, I think as the album closer, closing it here with Bruce Kulick on lead vocals was certainly a choice. Time for the pseudo-reunion album, Psycho Circus from 1998. Best song on here is Into the Void. Ace was barely allowed, or willing, depending on who you ask, to play on Psycho Circus, and yet he still wrote the best song on the album. Great riff, cool outer space-like atmosphere, fun lyrics, and a great live track on the subsequent tour as well. As for the worst on this record here, which is really a mixed bag, but I enjoy a lot of the tracks on here, but if I had to pick a worst, it would have to be You Wanted the Best. Just a cheesy, disingenuous song about the band finally playing together again because, the fans wanted, and to quote the band, we hear and we obey, which couldn't be further from the truth, considering how little Ace and Peter had to do with this album, and, even if it was true, it still would not be a great song, but knowing what we know now about Psycho Circus, it's just 4 minutes of the band straight up lying to us. Kiss went over a decade without releasing a new studio album until 2009 with Sonic Boom, and when they did, it was with the final lineup of Tommy Thayer and Eric Singer, and yes, it's the final lineup. The Avatars don't count as a lineup, but, it started off really promising with Modern Day Delilah. You could fit this song on any of those classic 70s Kiss albums, and it wouldn't sound out of place at all, and you'd think this album would be an all-timer, judging from this track, but unfortunately the record peaks here and just never recovers. The worst for me has got to be Say Yeah, the album closer for Sonic Boom. The band have tried to make this a live staple throughout the years, and I never understood why. It's not a crowd pleaser. It felt totally out of place in the set list for the End of the Road tour, and it just comes off as a forced, monotonous sing-along. And if the band really wanted to cement one track with the Tommy and Eric lineup in their set list as a de facto modern classic, why not go with Modern Day Delilah instead? And last but not least, we've reached their final studio album, Monster, from 2012. Much stronger than Sonic Boom. I think if you combine the two, though, you'd have one really strong modern Kiss album. Favorite song here is Hell or Hallelujah. I think this is a great example of the old school spark that was still there at times. And, this song, like Modern Day Delilah, sounds like classic Kiss. Best on the record for sure. The worst song is going to be Out of This World. This is a really frustrating song. It's the only song in the Kiss catalog sung by Tommy Thayer, and it's written in the exact style of Ace Frehley, with the exact lyrics that Ace would write, and the exact type of riff that Ace would play. Even, Tommy's cadence on this track is Ace Frehley-like. It just comes down to everything I dislike about Tommy and Eric and the band. They're more than capable musicians, no doubt about it, but they turn into imposters by copying everything about Ace and Peter, from the image to the mannerisms and playing style, and just to think, this would be a classic Ace Frehley song, but instead just feels like a bad interpretation. So that wraps up this video here, going through the rather expansive catalog of Kiss, sharing with you guys my favorite and least favorite song from each record. Some of these were definitely easier to, find a best and a worst than others. There are definitely some classics here and some mixed bag records as well. Their catalog is kind of all over the place, right? Lots of different styles and sounds, lineup changes, mixed receptions, good receptions, stuff like that. So it was a lot to talk about here, and this was, pretty big project, but I do enjoy doing these. I did this for Iron Maiden, the best and worst from each album, had a lot of fun with that, so I thought I'd do it again here for Kiss, and I'll keep doing these as long as you guys enjoy them. And so if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below, turn on the bell for notifications so you don't miss a new upload, and be sure to let me know down in the comment section below what are your thoughts on my picks and what are some of your favorite and least favorite Kiss songs of all time. I want to hear from you, and until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.